The generator died at 9:17 p.m. outside the blizzard-swallowed Pine Hollow hole. Inside the cabin, Ethan Walker stood frozen, one hand on the lantern, the other on Atlas's collar. "We don't have enough heat to make it till morning," he said. The German shepherd didn't bark. He turned, walked straight into the unfinished passage, and stopped beside the workshop wall. "Not now, boy," Ethan whispered. But Atlas scratched the same wooden seam again, once, twice. Then cold air breathed through the boards. Ethan had lost his house, his savings, and nearly himself. But behind that wall was the reason someone had been waiting for him. The morning Ethan Walker lost the house, the sky over Ashford, Oregon, looked almost kind. That was the part he would remember later, how the clouds had parted just enough to let a pale strip of sunlight fall across the front porch, touching the chipped railing, the empty flower boxes, the brass number beside the door that Laura had polished every spring until it shone like something worth coming home to. Nothing about the light looked final. Nothing about the quiet warned him that by noon, the place where he had learned to sleep again after the service, the place where his wife had once hummed while folding towels, the place where his German shepherd had worn a path from the kitchen to the back door, would belong to a bank folder, a lockbox, and a man with a clipboard who kept saying he was sorry in a voice that had practiced the sentence too many times. Ethan was 42, broad through the shoulders, but thinner than he used to be, with close-cut brown hair salted at the temples and gray eyes that seemed to check every room before allowing the rest of him to enter. Years in uniform had left him with habits he could not retire. Boots lined by the door, keys in the same dish back to the wall, exits counted without thinking. But grief had added its own discipline. Pay this bill first. Delay that notice. Answer only the calls you can survive. Do not open Laura's closet after dark. Do not sit too long at the kitchen table. Do not let anyone hear your voice crack. Atlas knew anyway. The German shepherd stood beside him in the hollowed-out living room, 6 years old, black and tan coat brushed but beginning to dull at the edges from stress. Ears high, amber eyes fixed not on the movers, not on the boxes, not on the stranger changing the lock, but on Ethan's hands. Those hands had once been steady enough to repair field radios in bad weather, to tie knots in darkness, to calm frightened men with a touch on the shoulder. Now they hovered uselessly over a cardboard box labeled kitchen, as if he had forgotten what hands were for. "Last load, Mr. Walker," the man with the clipboard said. He said it gently, which made it worse. Ethan nodded because nodding required less dignity than speaking. In the truck bed sat everything the bank did not want: 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, Laura's cedar chest, 3 cartons of clothes, a coffee maker with a cracked lid, and a wooden box Ethan had not seen since the month after Laura's funeral. It was small, dark, weathered at the corners, the kind of box people keep, because throwing it away would feel like betraying someone. Atlas had been calm all morning until that box was carried out. Then he changed. He stepped in front of it, planted his paws on the driveway, and refused to move. "Atlas," Ethan said softly. The dog did not look at him. "Come on, boy. We're done here." Atlas lowered his head and pressed his nose against the lid. Not a nudge, not curiosity, something closer to recognition. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation rise in him, then die before it became sound. He was too tired to be angry, and Atlas had earned the right to be strange. The dog had slept beside him through nights when the house had seemed too large for one breathing man. He had followed Ethan from room to room after Laura died, never crowding, never demanding, just making sure silence did not swallow him whole. So Ethan crouched, his knees stiff, and set one hand on the dog's back. Atlas trembled once beneath his palm. That frightened him more than any bark could have. Ethan opened the box. The smell came first. Cedar paper, faint lavender from the sachets Laura used to tuck into drawers. Inside were folded scarves. A cracked photograph of Laura at 29 standing beside a lake, a bundle of letters tied with blue thread, and beneath them, hidden flat against the bottom, an envelope yellowed at the edges. Ethan knew at once it was not Laura's handwriting. Hers had been rounder, warmer, always leaning forward like it was eager to arrive. This writing was narrow, careful, old-fashioned. On the front, in dark ink that had faded but not surrendered, were 7 words. For Ethan, when the house no longer feels like home. The driveway seemed to tilt. Somewhere behind him, the clipboard man cleared his throat and then thought better of saying anything. A truck passed on the street. A crow called once from the maple tree Laura had wanted to save during the ice storm 4 winters ago. Ordinary sounds, all of them. Yet Ethan felt the world grow quieter around that envelope, as if the day itself had leaned in. Atlas sat down beside him, so close his shoulder pressed against Ethan's knee. The dog's eyes did not leave the letter. Ethan turned it over. The seal had never been broken. For a long moment he did not open it. He only held it, feeling the thinness of paper, the impossible weight of timing. He had spent the past year believing life had taken everything in the proper order. First Laura, then savings, then sleep, then the house. But now, in the last hour of belonging anywhere, something hidden had reached up from the bottom of a forgotten box and called him by name. Ethan looked back at the empty doorway, at the rooms already losing the shape of him, then down at Atlas, whose steady breath warmed the cold air between them. "What did she leave us, boy?" he whispered. Atlas gave no answer. He simply stood, turned toward the truck, and waited as if the road ahead had been chosen long before Ethan was ready to follow it. Before the letters from the bank began arriving in pairs, before the phone calls learned to come at dinner time, before Ethan Walker started sleeping with his boots beside the bed, as if leaving quickly could still save anything. His life had been small in a way that almost felt merciful. He woke every morning at 5:10, not because an alarm told him to, but because his body had never fully accepted that nobody was ordering him up anymore. The house would be dark then, Ashford still wrapped in that blue hour before traffic, before leaf blowers, before neighbors raised garage doors and stepped into their ordinary lives. Ethan would sit at the kitchen table with coffee strong enough to taste like burned earth, one hand around the mug, the other resting on Atlas's head. The German shepherd always came before the first sip. He would appear from the hallway without a sound, broad chest moving slow, ears relaxed, eyes still carrying sleep but already reading Ethan's breathing. Laura used to laugh at that. "He checks on you like a nurse with paws," she'd say, standing at the counter in one of Ethan's old sweatshirts, her hair pinned badly, her smile soft from sleep. After she died, the joke stayed in the room longer than she did. Ethan kept the routine because routines were safer than memory. Coffee, boots, feed Atlas. Walk 2 miles past the old post office, down to the bridge, back along Hawthorne Street, where the houses had gardens and porch flags, and people who waved without knowing what a wave could cost. Then work at Miller's Feed and Supply from 8 to 2, sometimes 4 if Dale needed help unloading bags of seed or fixing the register that jammed whenever the air got damp. It wasn't military work. It wasn't important in the way he used to understand importance. But there was comfort in things that could be stacked, labeled, lifted, priced. A bag of soil weighed what it weighed. A fence hinge either fit or didn't. Nobody asked a hinge how it was holding up. The first medical bill after Laura's funeral had been easy to misunderstand. Ethan opened it standing at the sink, still wearing his black tie loosened at the throat, and stared at the number as if the decimal had slipped. There were insurance adjustments, provider balances, late notices from offices he didn't remember visiting. He set the bill beside the toaster and told himself paperwork always looked worse before it made sense. Then another came, then another. The mailbox became a mouth that never stopped asking. He sold Laura's car first. Then the fishing boat they had bought secondhand and used only twice because Laura got seasick, but insisted she loved the idea of being lake people. He canceled the cable, repaired the furnace himself, patched the roof with borrowed tools, and learned which grocery store marked down meat on Wednesday nights. The mortgage, though, remained stubborn and clean and official. It did not care that Laura's name still appeared on certain envelopes. It did not care that Ethan had served 12 years, that he had once carried other men's fear in his own chest so they could keep moving. It cared about dates. It cared about numbers. It cared about signatures in black ink. People were kind, mostly. That was part of the ache. Dale at the feed store gave him extra shifts and pretended not to. Mrs. Hanley from across the street brought soup in jars and said he could keep the jars, as if glass containers might quietly rebuild a life. The woman at the bank lowered her voice when she explained deferment options, her eyes sliding to the service patch on Ethan's jacket with a mixture of respect and pity he had come to dislike equally. "Thank you for your service," she said when the appointment ended. Ethan nodded. Because Americans had taught him there was no graceful answer to that sentence. Outside, Atlas waited in the truck, nose pressed to the cracked window, tail giving one slow thump when Ethan opened the door. That was the thing about Atlas. He never thanked Ethan for anything. He never pitied him either. He simply made room. At night, when the house settled and the refrigerator hummed like a distant engine, Ethan would sit in Laura's chair without meaning to. Atlas would lie across his feet, heavy and warm, anchoring him to the floor. Sometimes Ethan would look around the kitchen and count what remained. 2 plates, 1 mug with a chipped handle, a photograph on the sill, a dog breathing in his sleep. He had protected convoys. He had crossed deserts under skies that seemed too wide for mercy. He had come home believing the hard part was behind him. But there were battles that made no sound at all, no blast, no smoke, just paper, interest, silence, and the slow humiliation of realizing that a man could do everything quietly, responsibly, stubbornly, and still fall behind. The last notice arrived on a Thursday in early March, folded with professional neatness, printed in language so calm it felt almost cruel. Ethan read it twice. Then he read it a third time, because grief had taught him that facts sometimes needed repetition before they became real. Atlas rose from the kitchen rug and came to him. The dog did not whine. He pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg and stayed there. Ethan placed the letter on the table, palm flat over the bank's logo, and closed his eyes. For a moment he saw Laura standing by the window, sunlight caught in her hair, saying his name the way people say a word they trust. When he opened his eyes, the kitchen was dim, the coffee cold, and the house already beginning to feel like something he was being allowed to visit. The day the house stopped being his, Ethan woke before dawn and did not make coffee. That was how he knew some part of him had already surrendered. The kitchen still held the shape of the life he had tried to keep. 2 chairs at the table, though only one had been used for years. A faded dish towel. Hanging from the oven handle, Laura's blue mug turned upside down near the sink, because he could never bring himself to put it in a box. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, not hard enough to be called weather, just enough to make the morning feel unfinished. Atlas stood in the doorway and watched him with the stillness of a creature that understood movement would only make the moment louder. Ethan had packed most of the night. He labeled boxes in block letters because order was the last thing he could still control. Winter clothes, kitchen, Laura. That final label had taken him nearly 5 minutes to write. Not because the word was difficult, but because names could become rooms, and rooms could become weather, and grief had a way of filling both. At 9:20, a white sedan pulled up behind a county vehicle. 2 people stepped out, a locksmith with a gray beard and a woman from the property office wearing a navy coat, holding a folder against her chest as if it might protect her from the discomfort of being necessary. She introduced herself as Karen Bell. Her voice was careful, her smile small and apologetic. Ethan shook her hand because his father had taught him that manners mattered most when pride was bleeding. "Mr. Wallace," she began, glancing at the folder. Just looked. Her face changed before he spoke. "Walker," he said. "Ethan Walker." Color rose in her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. It was a tiny mistake. Nobody meant harm by it. That was what made it cut so cleanly." Ethan had spent months being reduced to account numbers, balances, case notes, due dates, and now, at the door of the last place that still knew his footsteps, even his name had come loose in somebody else's hands. Atlas moved then, not aggressively, not with a sound, only 1 step closer until his shoulder touched Ethan's leg. The weight steadied him. Karen explained the process, the final walkthrough, the lock change, the transfer of possession. Ethan listened, nodded where a nod belonged, signed where a signature was required. His handwriting looked unfamiliar, thinner than it used to be. The locksmith waited on the porch, eyes lowered, giving him the mercy of not watching too closely. Room by room, Ethan checked what remained. The bedroom was empty except for the pale rectangle on the wall where a framed photograph had hung. The hallway smelled faintly of cardboard dust. In the living room, sunlight moved across the floorboards in slow bands, touching scratches Atlas had made as a puppy when he used to slide after tennis balls Laura rolled from the couch. Ethan stood there longer than he meant to. Atlas sniffed the floor once, then sat beside him, ears lowered, as if honoring a place rather than claiming it. "We did all right here," Ethan whispered. The words surprised him. He had meant to think them, not say them, but the empty room took them gently. He carried the last box himself. It was Laura's cedar chest, heavier than it looked, not from weight but from what hands remembered. Karen offered to help. Ethan thanked her and said he had it. Outside, he loaded it into the truck bed beside the others, then returned for one final thing, the house key. It lay on the counter where he had placed it the night before. Small, ordinary, ridiculous in its power. He picked it up and felt the ghost of every evening he had turned it in the lock after work. Every winter night he had pushed the door open to warmth. Every time Laura had called from another room, "Is that you?" The answer had always been yes. Now the house would no longer ask. On the porch, Karen held out a plastic envelope for the keys. Ethan dropped them in. The sound they made was soft, almost nothing, and yet something inside him moved sharply away from it. The locksmith changed the front lock in less than 3 minutes. Ethan watched without expression. He would not give this day a scene. He would not beg a door to remember him. When it was done, Karen handed him a copy of the paperwork. "I really am sorry," she said. Ethan looked at her then and for the first time saw not a system, not an enemy, but a tired woman doing a job that probably followed her home. "I know," he said. "Just remember the next man's name." She swallowed, nodded once, and looked down. Ethan climbed into the truck. Atlas took the passenger seat, tall and silent, his amber eyes fixed on the house as they backed out of the driveway. For a moment Ethan thought the dog might whine, but he didn't. Atlas simply watched until the porch disappeared behind the maple tree, until the brass numbers blurred in the rain, until the road bent and the house was gone. Only then did Ethan exhale. It came out broken, but quiet. Ethan did not open the envelope until the truck was parked behind a closed gas station on the northern edge of Ashford, where the road noise thinned and the rain turned the windshield into a trembling sheet of gray. For almost an hour he sat with both hands on the steering wheel, watching water gather along the glass and slide down in crooked paths, each one disappearing before it reached the hood. Atlas lay across the passenger seat, too large for comfort, his muzzle resting near the sealed letter as if guarding it from the rest of the world. The truck cab smelled of wet denim, cedar, old coffee, and the faint dogworm scent that had become over the years Ethan's last reliable version of home. He told himself he was waiting because the light was poor, then because his hands were cold, then because a man who had just lost his house deserved 10 quiet minutes before letting a dead woman speak. But the truth was simpler and harder. He was afraid the letter would explain too much or not enough. When he finally broke the seal, the paper unfolded with a dry, fragile whisper. The handwriting inside was the same narrow, careful script from the envelope. "Dear Ethan," it began, "if this has reached you, then Laura kept her promise and did not show it to you too soon." Ethan stopped there. His throat tightened, not with anger exactly, but with the old ache of being protected without being asked. Laura had always known the places where he was brittle. She had also known that sometimes mercy could feel like secrecy when discovered late. He read on. "My name is Margaret Hale. I was Laura's aunt, though she called me Maggie when she wanted something, or when she was trying to make me laugh. There is land in Pine Hollow, Oregon. Land my father bought after the mill closed and everyone sensible moved closer to town. I lived there for 31 years. It is not beautiful in the way magazines use that word. It is hard, cold, stubborn country, but it is honest, and honesty can be a kind of shelter." Ethan looked up at the rain-dark road. Pine Hollow was a name he knew only from old maps and weather warnings, somewhere east toward the Cascades, where storms arrived early and stayed longer than invited. Atlas lifted his head, ears pricking, as if the name had entered the cab with weight. The letter continued. "There is a cabin, a workshop, a root cellar, and the beginning of a covered passage between them. I built it after a winter, when the wind taught me that distance does not have to be large to become dangerous. 20 yards can feel like a mile when snow takes the world apart. I meant to finish it, I did not. Pride, age, and the foolish belief that time would remain generous got in the way." Ethan ran his thumb over the ink. The words did not ask for pity. They stood straight on the page. Beneath the letter was a hand-drawn map, folded twice, with creek lines, a dirt road, a gate marked by 2 iron posts, and a square labeled house in block letters. A smaller note was clipped to it. "Do not come here to disappear, Ethan. Come only if you are willing to learn how to live with respect. Respect for the land, respect for weather, respect for your own limits. and respect for any person the world has taught you to overlook." That sentence held him longer than the rest. He had spent years mistaking endurance for dignity. He had thought needing nothing was the highest form of strength. Yet here was a woman he barely remembered, reaching across 7 years to tell him that survival without respect could become another kind of loneliness. At the bottom of the page, Margaret had written one final line. "The deed may still be valid." Laura knew where the papers were. Look beneath what she could not throw away. Ethan turned slowly toward the cedar chest in the truck bed, visible through the rear window under a blue tarp beaded with rain. For the first time all day, the loss of the house did not feel like an ending with a period. It felt like a door left unlatched somewhere far away. Atlas sat up fully now, eyes bright, body still. Ethan let out a breath that shook once and steadied. "Pine Hollow," he said quietly. Atlas's tail gave a single measured thump against the seat. Not excitement. Recognition. Ethan folded the letter with care, placed it back in the envelope, and looked toward the highway stretching north through the rain. He did not feel hopeful yet. Hope was too large a word, too clean for a man sitting in a truck with no address of his own. But something smaller had arrived, something rough-edged and stubborn. A direction. Ethan spent the next 2 days learning how little a man could own and still feel crowded by the weight of it. He slept in the truck behind a church the first night, then beside a rest area where freight trucks came and went like dark ships through rain. Atlas slept lightly, raising his head whenever tires hissed too close or footsteps crossed the gravel, but he never barked. He simply watched the world, with that grave patience dogs have when they understand their person is standing at the edge of something and must not be rushed. In the mornings, Ethan washed his face in gas station sinks, shaved badly with a disposable razor, and folded Margaret Hale's letter so many times along the creases that the paper began to soften. He searched county records on the public computer at the Ashford Library. Sitting beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired, the land in Pine Hollow was real. 26 acres, cabin, outbuilding, unpaid taxes, but not enough to erase the deed. Laura's name appeared in one scanned document as a secondary heir, her signature dated 4 years earlier. Ethan stared at it until the letters blurred. She had known, not just vaguely, not as a family rumor tucked away with old recipes and dead relatives' names. She had signed something. She had carried this place quietly beside their ordinary life, through grocery lists and furnace repairs and doctor appointments, and she had never told him. Anger came then, sudden and clean, almost refreshing after months of dull grief. He closed the browser, walked outside, and stood under the library awning while rain stitched the parking lot silver. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said aloud. Not loudly, not to anyone living. Atlas leaned against his leg. Ethan pulled away at first, then hated himself for it and rested one hand between the dog's ears. The answer, when it came, did not come as a voice. It came as memory. Laura watching him from the kitchen doorway during his worst winter home, when he had spent whole afternoons in the garage pretending to fix tools because the house felt too warm, too soft, too full of things he could lose. She had once said, "I don't want the woods to become another place you disappear into." At the time, he had thought she meant hunting trips. Now he understood she had meant something deeper. She had not hidden a refuge from him. She had hidden an exit he might have mistaken for surrender. That night, Ethan parked near the edge of town and opened the cedar chest beneath the glow of a convenience store sign. Beneath Laura's wool coat, beneath an old quilt, beneath a stack of photographs tied with ribbon, he found a flat envelope taped to the bottom panel. Inside were the deed papers, a spare key darkened with age, and a note in Laura's hand. "Ethan, if you are reading this, I waited too long or left too soon. Maybe both. Don't go there because you have nothing left. Go there only if some part of you still wants to build." He read the note once, then again. Then he pressed it carefully against his chest, not dramatically, not like a man in a movie, but like someone trying to keep a wound from opening wider. Atlas climbed halfway across the console and set his head on Ethan's shoulder, heavy, warm, unashamed. For the first time since the house keys dropped into that plastic envelope, Ethan did not feel chased. He felt measured by a question. Did he still want to build? By dawn he had his answer, though it was not brave enough to call itself hope. He bought a paper map because the old roads near Pine Hollow did not trust cell service. He spent $40 on dog food, canned soup, water, batteries, and a cheap thermos. He filled the truck with gas, watching the numbers climb higher than he liked. Then he stood beside the pump, palm flat on the hood, looking west at the city that no longer had a door for him and east toward weather, timber, unpaid taxes, and a cabin he had never seen. "We're not looking for a miracle," he told Atlas. The shepherd sat straight in the passenger seat, ears forward as if receiving orders. Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile. Just one last chance. He turned the key. The engine caught rough, then steadied. Ashford fell behind them, one traffic light at a time, then one wet mile, then one long curve of highway. Streetlights gave way to fir trees. Storefronts gave way to fields. By afternoon, the mountains rose ahead, blue and severe beneath a low ceiling of cloud. Ethan drove toward them with both hands on the wheel. Not saved, not healed, not certain of anything except direction. Beside him, Atlas watched the road as though he had been waiting for it all along. Pine Hollow did not announce itself so much as thin into view. By the time Ethan reached the county line, the highway had narrowed to 2 lanes, and the rain had become a fine wind-blown mist that clung to the windshield in silver threads. The last gas station sat 10 miles back. The last cell signal had disappeared somewhere after a leaning sign for a Christmas tree farm. Ahead, the road climbed through fir and hemlock, each curve drawing the truck deeper into a country that seemed less abandoned than private, as if the land had simply chosen not to explain itself to strangers. Atlas sat upright beside him, nose working at the cracked window, ears shifting with every sound Ethan could not hear. The paper map lay open across the console, Margaret Hale's careful pencil marks matching, imperfectly, the road before them. 2 iron posts, she had written. No gate if the weather took it. The iron posts appeared just before dusk, dark and narrow beneath a tangle of blackberry vines. Ethan nearly missed them. He braked, reversed slowly, and turned onto what was less a driveway than a memory of one. Branches brushed both sides of the truck. Mud pulled at the tires. Twice he had to stop and clear fallen limbs from the track, while Atlas stood in the wet leaves watching the tree line with quiet seriousness, not afraid, only attentive. After half a mile, the trees opened. The cabin stood in a shallow clearing, gray-brown, steep-roofed and smaller than Ethan expected. Moss furred the edges of the porch. One shutter hung slightly crooked. The chimney leaned but had not fallen. Behind it, half hidden by firs, sat a long workshop with weathered siding and 2 wide doors barred from the outside. To the left, a low mound and stone-framed entry marked the root cellar, and between the cabin and workshop stretched the strangest thing on the property. The bones of a covered passage, raised a few feet above the ground, running from one building toward the other but stopping short, unfinished, like a sentence interrupted by winter. Ethan shut off the engine. The silence after it felt enormous, not empty. Listening, Atlas jumped down first, landing lightly despite the long ride, then moved across the clearing with his head low. He sniffed the porch, circled the first post of the passage, and paused where the structure ended in open air. Ethan followed, boots sinking into wet needles. The passage frame was solid, built from thick cedar beams darkened by years of weather. Some roof panels were in place. Others were missing, leaving gaps where the sky showed through. The side rails reached waist height, enough to break the wind but not seal out the world. Margaret had not designed a hallway. She had designed a negotiation, a way to cross 20 yards without pretending the storm was not there. "You were serious, Maggie," Ethan murmured. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of dust, cold ash and old pine. Furniture remained under sheets. A cast-iron stove crouched in the main room. There were canned goods in a pantry, some too old to trust, some still usable, a narrow bed, a table scarred by tools or weather or years of elbows. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a younger Margaret standing beside the unfinished passage, one hand on a beam, her face unsmiling but proud. Ethan stared at it longer than he meant to. He had expected ruin. What he found was preparation left waiting. In the workshop, he discovered stacked lumber, jars of screws sorted by size, hand tools wrapped in oilcloth, and rolled plans weighted by a rusted wrench. Atlas trotted ahead between workbenches, then returned to Ethan as if reporting that the place had been inspected and judged possible. Possible. The word landed carefully. Not safe, not easy, not home, but possible. As darkness settled, Ethan carried in his duffel, dog food, lanterns, and Laura's cedar chest. He built a small fire after 3 failed attempts and 1 quiet curse, then sat on the cabin floor with his back against the wall. Atlas stretched beside him. The wind moved around the cabin, testing corners. Somewhere outside, the unfinished passage creaked once, not like a warning, but like an old body shifting in sleep. Ethan looked through the window at its dark frame standing between cabin and workshop. For the first time, he understood Margaret's letter not as a mystery, but as an unfinished request. Build what protects life, respect the distance, finish the crossing. Atlas lifted his head and looked toward the passage, too. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. "All right," he said softly. "We'll see what she left us." Morning in Pine Hollow arrived without kindness, but not without order. The cold entered first, slipping through the cabin seams before the sun cleared the furs, laying its pale hands on Ethan's face until he opened his eyes on the narrow bed and remembered, with a small inward drop, that he no longer knew the sound of his old neighborhood waking. No garbage truck groaning at 7, no garage doors, no distant school traffic. Only wind in the trees, the soft tick of ashes cooling in the stove, and Atlas breathing beside the bed like a second, steadier clock. Ethan rose carefully, every joint announcing the truck ride, the floorboards answering beneath his boots. He fed Atlas, boiled coffee over the small propane burner, and spread Margaret's plans across the table. In daylight, the drawings looked less mysterious and more demanding. Angles, measurements, notes in the margins. Roof pitch must shed wet snow. Leave breathing gaps under side panels. Do not seal the passage completely. Moisture trapped is rot invited. Ethan read that last line twice, then looked toward the window where the unfinished structure stood between cabin and workshop, silvered with frost. There was something almost personal in the instruction. Do not seal completely. Let it breathe or it breaks. He spent the morning taking inventory. The root cellar held jars of beans, peaches, tomatoes, and apple butter, some labeled in Margaret's tight hand from 8 years earlier, some newer than expected. The workshop offered more hope. Cedar planks stacked beneath canvas. A handsaw 2 levels, a box of hinges, roofing panels, nails sorted into coffee cans. The generator coughed but started. After he cleaned the plug and coaxed the old engine with the patience of a man who had once trusted machines in worse places than this, Atlas followed everywhere. Not underfoot, never in the way, but close enough that Ethan felt the dog's presence like a line tied gently around his ribs. When Ethan measured the passage, Atlas walked its length ahead of him, paused at weak boards, sniffed corners where damp had gathered, and once pressed his nose against a gap in the cabin wall that Ethan would have missed until winter made it expensive. "Inspector Atlas," Ethan said, the first joke he had spoken in days. The dog glanced back, solemn as a judge, and Ethan almost smiled. By afternoon, he was working the way work had always saved him. One task, then the next. Replace 2 cracked boards, clear moss from the roof frame, stack dry kindling near the stove, mark missing panels, patch the draft near the pantry. He moved slowly, but slowly was not the same as failing. That was a lesson the woods seemed determined to teach. In the service, speed had often meant survival. Here, speed wasted wood, bent nails, split boards, and exhausted a man before dark. Pine Hollow rewarded attention, not force. It asked him to listen before acting, to test each beam, to watch how water traveled, to notice where wind pressed hardest against the clearing. Near sunset, a bank of clouds lowered over the ridge, and the temperature dropped fast. Ethan carried firewood from the shed to the porch, arms aching, breath white. Halfway back, a sharp wave of panic rose without warning, the kind that had no visible cause and no manners. His chest tightened, the clearing tilted. The trees seemed suddenly too close, the sky too low. He set the wood down before he dropped it. Atlas came at once. No bark, no command needed. The German shepherd leaned his full weight against Ethan's thigh, then pushed his head beneath Ethan's hand, insisting on touch, on here, on now. Ethan gripped the thick fur at Atlas's neck and breathed until the world returned in pieces. Cold air, pine scent, rough bark, dog warmth, his own boots in mud. "I'm here," he whispered, though he did not know whether he was telling Atlas or himself. That night, by lantern light, Ethan read more of Margaret's notebook. She wrote about weather as if it were a neighbor. Never trust it blindly, never insult it by pretending it cannot hear you. She wrote about tools, about storing fuel, about checking on people who lived alone because pride was often loudest just before trouble. One sentence stopped him. A house is not humane because it keeps you warm. It becomes humane when it teaches you to make room for life. Ethan looked down at Atlas asleep beside the stove, one paw twitching in some private dream. He thought of the bank office, the wrong name, the quiet shame of needing help. Then he looked at the passage outside, unfinished but standing. Maybe respect began there, not as a speech, not as charity, but as construction, leaving breathing space, building shelter between distances, making sure no living thing had to cross the cold alone. Winter came to Pine Hollow the way bad news often came to Ethan Walker now. Earlier than promised, quieter than expected, and with no interest in whether he was ready. The first hard frost silvered the clearing before Halloween, stiffening the grass around the cabin and glazing the unfinished passage until every beam shone faintly in the blue morning light. By then, Ethan had repaired most of the roofline, braced the weaker posts, and closed the windward side with cedar panels cut to Margaret's measurements. From a distance, the structure almost looked whole. Almost, that word began to trouble him. Almost warm was still cold. Almost paid was still overdue. Almost safe in weather like this could become a crueler thing than unsafe, because it tempted a man to trust what had not yet earned trust. The generator started skipping on the third evening of the cold snap, coughing in the workshop like an old smoker with a secret. Ethan cleaned the filter, checked the plug, drained water from the fuel line, and got it running again, but not smoothly. The sound came uneven through the wall after dark, rising and falling, a tired mechanical pulse that seemed to measure how much time he had left. On the kitchen table lay his notebook, fuel, lumber, roofing screws, dog food, propane, taxes. The numbers were plain. Plain things could be merciless. He had enough cash for one more supply run, maybe two if he chose badly and got lucky. The passage still needed 4 roof panels, flashing near the cabin end, and a better latch on the workshop door. The stove needed a new gasket. Atlas needed his joint medicine before the mountain roads closed. Ethan stared at the list until the words stopped behaving like words and became a single wall. Atlas watched from beside the stove, chin on his paws, eyes following Ethan's breathing. "Don't look at me like that," Ethan said, but there was no sharpness in it. The dog blinked slowly. Outside, wind slid through the trees, testing the cabin with long fingers. That night, Ethan worked too late in the workshop, trying to cut one warped cedar board into usefulness. The lantern threw his shadow against the wall, thin and bent, a stranger's shape. Twice he measured wrong. Once the saw drifted offline. The board split near the end with a dry crack, and the sound went through him with unreasonable force. He set the saw down carefully. Then he sat on the stool, both hands flat on the ruined plank, and felt something inside him loosen. Not rage, not even despair exactly. Something quieter. The old belief that if he stayed disciplined, if he worked hard enough, if he needed little and asked for less, the world would eventually meet him halfway. But the world did not always meet people halfway. Sometimes it watched them carry too much and called it character. Atlas rose. His nails clicked across the floor. He did not come to Ethan first. Instead, he walked to the back wall of the workshop, where a heavy shelf leaned beneath jars of screws and rusted clamps. He sniffed along the lower boards, paused, then scratched once at a narrow seam between 2 planks. Ethan did not move. "Not now, boy." Atlas scratched again. Softer this time, more insistence than noise. A thin line of cold air crossed the room and touched Ethan's wrist. He looked up. Atlas pressed his nose to the seam, then turned back to him. For a moment, Ethan simply sat there, too tired to be curious. Then the generator coughed outside, stumbled, and caught again. The lantern flame trembled. Ethan stood slowly and crossed the room. Behind the shelf, the wall did not sit flush. One plank had a hairline gap, too straight to be weather damage. He moved a jar, then another. Atlas stepped aside, watching. Ethan placed his palm against the wood. Cold breathed through it, steady and narrow, like the workshop was keeping one last secret. Ethan did not open the hidden space quickly. Some doors, he had learned, deserved a slower hand. He cleared the shelf first, jar by jar, setting screws, clamps, hinge pins, and rusted washers on the workbench in neat rows because order helped keep his breathing even. Atlas sat 3 feet away, still as a statue except for the slight movement of his nose, his amber eyes fixed on the wall as if whatever waited behind it had been calling to him all along. When the last jar was moved, Ethan gripped the edge of the shelf and pulled. It resisted, swollen by years of damp, then gave with a long wooden groan. Behind it, two vertical planks sat inside a frame too clean to be accidental. There was no handle, only a recessed notch dark with dust. Ethan slid his fingers into it and pulled. The narrow door opened inward. Cold air spilled out first, dry and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of paper, cedar shavings, and time held too tightly in a small room. Ethan lifted the lantern. The space was barely larger than a pantry. Shelves lined one wall. A work stool stood beneath them. On the floor rested a green metal lockbox, a stack of oilcloth-wrapped notebooks, 3 sealed envelopes, and a framed photograph turned face down as though even memory had needed privacy. Ethan stepped inside, and Atlas followed only to the threshold, refusing to cross until Ethan looked back and said, "It's all right, boy." The lockbox was not locked. That almost broke him more than if it had been. Inside, bundled with rubber bands and sorted into plain white envelopes, was cash. Not treasure, not movie money, just practical money. The kind folded by careful hands and saved against weather, fuel, lumber, repairs, medicine, taxes, emergency. Ethan counted it twice because his mind did not trust mercy on the first pass. $18,000. Clean 20s, 50s, and 100s. Each stack labeled in Margaret Hale's narrow handwriting. His first feeling was not relief. It was shame, sudden and hot. He had been sitting 20 feet from help while telling himself help did not exist. Then came anger, not at Margaret, not at Laura, but at the years he had spent believing need was a private failure. He lowered himself onto the stool and opened the top notebook. The first page read, "If you found this room, then winter arrived before Pride was done talking." Ethan let out a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, and not fully either. He turned the page. Margaret had written everything with unsentimental grace. Fuel calculations by week, roof angles for wet snow, notes on keeping ventilation gaps open, instructions for repairing the generator, a list of neighbors who could be trusted, and how they preferred to be asked for help. Ask Mrs. Bell for kerosene, not charity. Pay her when you can. Ask Jonah Reed about roofing tin. Do not let him refuse coffee. People accept respect more easily than rescue. Ethan read that line again. People accept respect more easily than rescue. It landed in him with the weight of something he had always known, but never had language for. The world had called him strong when he was silent, honorable when he was exhausted, admirable when he did not ask. Margaret, a woman dead or gone somewhere beyond forwarding addresses, had called him human instead. In the smallest envelope, he found Laura's handwriting. "I wanted to tell you. I was afraid you would come here to vanish. Maggie said the land should never be used as a grave for the living. If you are here now, please build something that lets you come back to people, not hide from them." The lantern blurred. Ethan pressed the heel of his hand to one eye, then the other, angry at the tears until Atlas stepped forward and placed his head on Ethan's knee with such calm certainty that resistance seemed foolish. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's skull. "You found it," he whispered. Atlas closed his eyes under the touch. Outside, the generator coughed, stumbled, then steadied. The unfinished passage creaked in the wind, waiting. Ethan gathered the money, the notebooks, and Margaret's plans, then stood in the doorway of the hidden room and looked back once. It did not feel like discovering wealth. It felt like being seen by someone who had known winter well enough to prepare mercy in advance. The storm arrived on a Monday with no drama in the morning and too much by nightfall. At dawn, Pine Hollow looked almost peaceful, the kind of stillness that made a man want to believe the forecast had been exaggerated. Ethan spent the day moving with careful purpose. He had bought the roofing panels from Jonah Reed, who refused to take full payment until Ethan sat down for coffee, just as Margaret's notebook had warned. He had fixed the generator, replaced the stove gasket, stacked 2 cords of dry wood under cover, and picked up Atlas's medicine from a clinic 30 miles away. The passage stood completed between the cabin and workshop, cedar-sided, roofed in dull gray tin, raised above the snow line, breathing through narrow gaps beneath the eaves exactly as Margaret had drawn it. It did not look impressive. That pleased Ethan. Things built to save lives rarely needed to look heroic. By 4 o'clock, the sky lowered into iron. By 5, snow moved sideways across the clearing. By 6, the world beyond the windows had vanished. Wind struck the cabin in long, muscular waves, making the old walls answer with creaks Ethan had learned to identify without fear. Roof beam, east corner, porch post, not danger, just pressure. Atlas lay near the stove, ears lifting whenever the storm pressed harder. Then the generator faltered, once, twice. The lights dimmed to a weak amber pulse. Ethan stood slowly, listening. The workshop held the generator panel and backup fuel line. In October, that 20-yard crossing had looked harmless. In this storm, it would have been a white mouth. Atlas rose before Ethan reached for his coat. "You coming?" Ethan asked. The dog gave him a look that said the question was beneath both of them. Ethan opened the interior door to the passage. Wind shoved against the outer wall, but inside the air held. Cold, yes. Moving, yes, but not wild. The tin roof rattled above them. Snow hissed through the breathing gaps in fine white dust, then fell harmlessly along the edges. Atlas went first, paws steady on the plank floor. Ethan followed with one hand sliding along the rail Margaret had insisted be sanded smooth. Halfway across, he stopped. Not from fear, from recognition. He had not defeated the storm. He had learned how to move through it. The thought settled so gently that it did not feel like wisdom. It felt like the truth finally speaking in a voice he could hear. In the workshop, he cleared ice from the fuel line, reset the panel, and listened as the generator caught strong. When he returned through the passage, Atlas paused at the center and looked back toward him. Snow beat against the walls. The roof held. The floor held. Ethan's hand rested on the cedar rail. And for the first time in years, he felt protected by something he had helped finish. By morning, the storm had buried the clearing waist-deep, but the passage opened clean from cabin to workshop, a narrow, stubborn line through white silence. Ethan stood at the window with coffee in Laura's blue mug, Atlas leaning against his leg, and watched sunlight touch the roof panels one by one. In the weeks that followed, Pine Hollow stopped being a hiding place and became a place with names. Mrs. Bell came by with kerosene and left with repaired hinges. Jonah brought extra roofing tin and stayed for stew. A retired mechanic named Luis Martinez showed Ethan how to coax another 10 years from the old generator. Ethan began opening the workshop on Saturdays for veterans, widowers, shut-ins, and anyone else who had been made to feel like a burden because life had asked too much of them. No speeches, no pity. Just coffee, tools, patient hands, and the quiet dignity of being useful at your own pace. Months later, Karen Bell from the property office drove up from Ashford with paperwork related to the deed. She stood at the edge of the passage, looking embarrassed by the memory she had carried with her. "Mr. Walker," she said carefully, "I wanted to say I'm sorry for the name, for that day." Ethan looked at her a moment, then at Atlas, who had risen to greet her without suspicion. "Thank you," he said. "Just remember the next man's name." She nodded, eyes bright, understanding more than the sentence said. By the next winter, people in Pine Hollow called the structure the Walker Passage. Ethan never corrected them, though privately he thought Margaret had earned the beams, Laura had kept the key, and Atlas had found the door. On quiet evenings, when snow began to fall and the workshop lights glowed warm at the far end, Ethan would stand in the passage with his hand on the rail and listen to the wind move around what they had built. It was not a monument. It was not a miracle. It was simply a way through, and sometimes for a man, a dog, and the people who came after them, a way through was enough to begin again. If this story moved you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me which moment stayed with you the most. And before you go, drop your city or state in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from.